So again, first we'll be hearing from Jeff Koski, who is the president of KB Advisory Group, a real estate market and economic impact analysis specialty firm located in Atlanta, Georgia. Jeff will share with us tonight information about the projections and growth trends of housing in Lexington-Fayette County, forecasting household growth and future housing demand, along with recommendations to address the same in order to help us better understand how we can shape land use policies in Lexington to meet these housing demands. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Jeff. He's going to be joining us via Zoom. And for all the work that you've done, I'm going to turn the screen around so you can see the audience, and we will go from there. So without further ado, Jeff Koski.
All right. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you very much. Let me get my screen going here. Let's see. While I'm doing that, good to see everyone on this Tuesday evening. All right. I think you should see my screen now. I didn't hear the introduction, so I won't go too deep into who I am, but I'm sure Brittany did a good job. But I'm Jeff Koski, president and owner of KB Advisory Group. We are a real estate market analysis and economic development consulting firm here in Atlanta. We do a lot of work with LAS, and you'll hear from Stan later. They are a frequent collaborator of ours. We are urban planners, but we're often known as the numbers people. We get involved in crunching a lot of numbers, often regarding the supply and demand of real estate, and particularly housing. And so that's what we're here to talk about tonight, obviously, is a little bit about the supply and demand of real estate as you all look out for 25 years in your land inventory and the built environment on which it occupies the land. And so we'll talk about that. We got involved with this process back in the fall. And so a lot of this analysis that we'll talk about tonight, again, you can see in the bottom right here, it goes back to really, we delivered this report in September. I just wanted to note that because I think it's still very relevant, and we haven't seen the dynamics change much over the past 6 months from when we delivered this, but you should just know there's some data points in here that we have year-to-date data from 2023, not necessarily year-end data. But again, as we go back and look at it, we think the findings are holding up pretty well. And they're intended to because, we're hoping that these findings are useful, again, for the next 25 years, at least 20 years, if not 25 years going out. So again, the idea here really, without reading everything on the screen, is really, what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so, is really, as I said, supply and demand of housing in Lexington, and particularly within the urban services boundary of Lexington. And how best really to get, as we say in this last bullet point, how best to get the most out of the developable land inside the boundary. And so again, we're looking at big trends, we're looking at national trends, we're looking at Kentucky trends, we're looking at citywide trends, and then we're trying to translate that into what could really be feasible in terms of potential development, and not just how much, but what type of development could be feasible, again, out through 2045 at least. So that's generally what I'm going to be talking about here. And again, I think as we move along, likely to incite some questions. I'm happy to answer questions, probably best given the situation, maybe to hold them till the end. But I'm more than happy to engage in conversation about this. So again, just kind of cutting to the chase, I'm gonna hit you with a lot of data. I'll try to make it as simple as possible so that you can kind of clue in on some big numbers. But I imagine if you've shown up tonight, you're interested, you want to see the numbers, you want to know what's behind the numbers. And so I'm gonna take a deep dive, but at the same time, you don't have to ingest every single number that you see to really make this make sense. And so again, starting really on the supply side of things, just looking at the historical trend, number of units that have been built over the past, going back to 2010. And again, you can see really it's been a steady growth of housing units being built, put on the ground. And again, one number I think is if you look over on the left in the words, kind of keep in your mind that on average, generally over the past 12 years, Lexington-Fayette has added approximately 1,000 units annually on average over the last decade. It's varied a little bit. You can see a little bit of ups and downs, but at the same time, if you just kind of think about, and it's actually a little bit higher than 1,000, but just trying to keep that number in mind that status quo has you adding about 1,000 new housing units into the city, into the county every year, right? So 1,000. And then what does that look like? And so over in the bottom right here, this is the distribution as it was counted by the census in 2022. This is really the best data available in terms of what type of housing is there on the ground. And again, you can see about 58%, so just over half are single family detached homes. And then you can see 26% are large multifamily, that's generally large apartment buildings, larger apartment buildings. And then you've got townhomes and a few other housing types in between. So that's kind of where things stand, where we've gotten up to, and where the mix is right now on the ground. So again, just digging in a little bit more to that supply side of things, I think it's important just to understand the supply side before we get into the future, right? Where our future forecast, we looked at the supply, but really the future forecast is a lot about demographics, and we'll get into that. But this is just sort of establishing where you've been, and so you kind of get a sense of when we say what the future might look like. This is good context for that. Is the future, how different does the future look than current? And so again, you can see just in terms of multifamily. And again, in this past 10 years, it's really, when we say multifamily, by and large, we're talking about apartments, rental apartments. There are a few condos, condominiums that would be included in here, but just in the past 10 years, there really hasn't been a lot of condo supply added locally or really nationally for that matter. The financing for building new condominiums, so for sale multifamily, has just not been there. But again, you can see that, pretty consistently, you've been adding at least 200 multifamily units every year. You can see that in some years, 2016, 2021, you've got up to around 900 new additions. And then again, by the fall of 2023, you had added over 700. So there is a range, but there's a pretty consistent additions to the inventory every year, and that grows on itself. So that was sort of the rental side, multifamily, largely rental, that's been added. Here's the number of home sales over just the past 5 years, 6 years here. And again, you can see that 2020 was it was an interesting year, but you had a large increase in number of home sales that year. You went over 500. Again, largely single family detached, some townhomes being sold, and again, you can see a sliver of condominiums, but that not too many in the most recent past. So again, you're adding kind of on average about almost 500 new multifamily, almost 400 here in single family. That number, that 1,000 number, is again is an average going back a little bit further. So it's, again, if you think about what's on the ground, and that about 58%, I believe it was, is single family. But now in the past 5 years or so, you're starting to see a shift a little bit towards new multifamily being added at a greater rate generally than single family. But it's still, what's being added is pretty much in line with what's there historically, with the slight shift a bit more to renters and multifamily over time. So that's the inventory, the supply that's being added. I don't think I have to tell you that home prices, it's much more difficult to buy a home nowadays than it was pre-pandemic times. You can see this is just the average overall price in Lexington. You can see it's spiking pretty good. You can also see that it was going up before the pandemic. So you have this kind of vertical line over on the far right that is kind of the post-pandemic trends. But you can see from 2014, really, your pricing had been going up. And one of the things why I wanted to bring this up, because I don't think anyone needs to, I don't think you need me to tell you that home prices have gone up over the past few years, but that you're really in line with national trends. And again, we do this type of work throughout the Southeast, really throughout the country. And, the old saying about real estate, right? Location, location, location. Every market is different. And it's true, every market has its own dynamics. But as we do housing studies again throughout the Southeast, people look at their home prices and they're like, man, we got a real problem here. Prices are through the roof. Nobody can afford anything. What's going on? Why is it so bad here? And there's a lot going on, but I just, it is a national trend. And again, I think most of us know this, but I just wanted to make sure that while there are specific and very specific, particularly with your urban services boundary, specific dynamics to your local market, this phenomenon of rising home prices has certainly been felt throughout the nation. It doesn't mean that you don't have something to worry about. I mean, it's a concern for everyone, but it is something that pretty much the entire nation is experiencing. And you have there are markets that you don't see these types of increases, and a lot of this is just you have demand, you have consistent demand with the university there, with some of your economy's stable, and so you're seeing more demand than supply for the most part, and that's why you're seeing prices go up. Just breaking that down a little bit in terms of the types of homes that are being sold and the pricing. Again, you see single family townhomes and condominiums again, and you can see pricing going up generally overall. But again, even pre-pandemic, you saw this sort of uptick in prices, particularly in townhomes. Townhomes have become much more, as we say over here on the text, townhomes are gaining market acceptance. We see that quite a bit. That it's become and again, a townhome, just for clarity's sake, right? A townhome would be basically a home that doesn't necessarily have a unit above it or below it, so it's on the ground, but it's sharing walls, right? So it's attached to other other housing units, but it's a for sale product. It's likely owned fee simple. It shares walls, but it doesn't share units above or below. If you got a units above or below, that would typically be a condominium, for sale condominium, just to make sure we're clear on that. And then again, this actually, I realize over on the upper left, this isn't for sale. This is for rent. This is again just tracking rents in the market. And again, you see increasing prices. But again, I'm pointing out here that while we track a lot of things nowadays back to the pandemic, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, lots of things changed in real estate. Certainly, you saw prices accelerate post 2020 in the multifamily rental side of things. You did see this increase, and again, you're kind of increasing at lockstep. Your rents are typically below the overall national average, but they are increasing at pretty much the same rate over the past decade. Last thing on supply here, just wanted to again point out, and I think this goes back to the for sale side, and there's a lot going on this slide, but if you really look at the bottom two pie charts, the main thing I wanted to really point out here is that you've seen the market just lose the ability to deliver new homes at less than 300,000 mostly, right? You can see in 2018, just as a snapshot in time, while certainly most of the homes being sold were above 300,000, you still had a pretty decent chunk, almost 20%. These are new homes being sold at less than 300,000, and so 2020 by 2022, we've really lost the bottom end of the market. And again, that's something we're seeing nationally, but it's something that says to us there's certainly demand for sale homes under 300,000. It's just hard for the market to deliver them, but it's something to think about as I talk about this demand in just a minute. We're going to look at this demand analysis, and part of this is to say, okay, not just that there is demand for new housing, but could you deliver it, and how could you deliver it in a place where there is demand, right? And so if basically to build a new single family or really even a townhome, it's going to take, because of the cost of construction, the cost of the land, it's gonna be a $300,000 house. It's more likely going to be a $400,000 house and above nowadays, but there's this big chunk of demand for people who theoretically could buy a home. They've got an income that historically would allow them to get a mortgage, but there isn't enough housing at those price points, particularly for new housing at the price points, between 200,000 and 400,000. The supply is really not there, even though the demand is potentially there. So then the question is, well, how do we get that type of unit? We used to have entry-level housing. We used to build entry-level housing, and it's become more difficult. So that's one thing we wanted to look at. And so we'll get to that in just a second. But kind of backing up on this demand thing, right? As we look at it, we think about the demand for housing. For the most part, when you see population growth, when you see household growth, when you see employment growth, what you see across the board in your community, you're creating housing demand, right? When you're creating new jobs, you're creating housing demand. When you're attracting new households, you're creating housing demand. And when you're not building enough housing and people got to crowd into the housing that's there, prices go up. And so that's partly what's going on here. And again, what we wanted to do to sort of forecast forward, well, how much housing is appropriate? What type of housing is appropriate? We started off looking at population projections. And again, this is just kind of give you a sense of generally what folks are saying about your local population. Whereas in 2020, with the census numbers, you had about just over 320,000 people living there, right? We took the green line as just kind of a straight line trend. The Kentucky Data Center says you're not going to grow quite as fast as the trend has been. The census has you growing a little bit slower in their forecasts. But really, when it comes down to housing, we really need to look at household growth, because while population is important, household formation comes into play, and that how many people per household matters. And so when we look at housing growth, we focus in on household growth that feeds housing demand. And so this is really the set of data, again, that's going to drive what I'm about to tell you about housing demand. And you can see, again, there's a spectrum of opinions about how many new households will be added. And again, this is looking at now new households to be added. And you can see that there was a study done a few years ago by Stantec that's out there publicly, that had you growing by over 40,000 households by 2040. So that was sort of the baseline we were looking at. That was one thing, and you can see the Stantec report that puts you at just over 2,000 new households annually. That's that blue line. That was really one of the data points that when we came into this, that when Brittany asked us to take a look at this, that was really kind of the bogey, if you will. Like, does that make any sense? Not to say that we were going to didn't believe Stantec. They're a perfectly great firm and do fantastic work throughout the country. But we wanted to kind of take a deeper dive, say what's behind that number. And again, you can kind of see their high number. You can also see that they had a conservative number, which is in red. And again, that red number was their conservative number, is really kind of in line with a lot of the other projections. And so again, as we started looking at the projections that have been made, folding them into our own housing forecast, we had to kind of think about what is aggressive and what is a little less aggressive. And so again, we were ambitious, actually was the word we used. And so here's this. And so we looked at this and we said, we kind of broke down, okay, what is the range of possibility, right? And it got us to about 33,000 units at the low end, about 42,000 units at the high end of housing unit potential out through 2045. And then you can see also this, as we're forecasting, again, household growth and employment growth, we can then go and also make additional commercial real estate projections. But we're not really talking about that office, retail, industrial. It's really the residential that we're focused on. And so as we built our models and did our analysis, you know, the further you get out, the we like to use the term the cone of uncertainty. You know, if you watch the Weather Channel and the tornado forecasts in the summer or hurricane forecasts in the summer, you know, you've got this, well, we know where it's gonna be today, we know where it's likely to be tomorrow. When you get 5 days out, the cone of uncertainty is much greater. And that's kind of what's going on here. When you do 25-year residential demands, you know, it's hard to be super confident about year 20 through 25, if you will. But we are very confident, again, on this idea that you should, and there could be demand for, you know, somewhere between 1,300 and 1,700 annual new residential units. And again, think back to that number I said at the beginning, 1,000, right? So you're adding have historically been adding just over 1,000 new housing units. Again, based on these household growth forecasts that I was just showing you, and thinking about where folks, what type of housing people want to be in, you know, we think that there is actually demand for more than you've been adding, which is part of the reason why prices are going up. But that, you know, how much more, you know, we think probably somewhere around 1,500 units on average annually on an average year is what you could be hitting in terms of housing demand. And again, if you got demand and you're not adding the housing for the households that want to be there, you end up in some weird situations. One is rising housing costs. But you also sort of end up with a hard time kind of figuring out your local service delivery from your local government point of view. Folks are having a hard time finding appropriate housing. It sort of becomes a difficult situation. And so finding the right number of housing units to try to add every year based on how many folks are out there looking for a house is important. And that's what this is all about. And then, of course, with your urban services boundary, figuring out not just how many, but where and what types of housing are we looking at. And so that's what this is starting to get into. Again, a lot of numbers. Hopefully you don't need binoculars to see it from where you're sitting. But again, we took that idea and we said, all right, of those, call it 1,500, you know, how many should be single family? How many should be townhome? How many should be multifamily? And then we also said, okay, what if you started to get more production in some of the housing types that you really haven't seen? And a lot of that might be considered what, you know, you may have heard this term missing middle. You're going to hear the term missing middle later. But this idea of something that's not a single family home and something that's not your typical apartment. Okay, townhomes I would consider missing middle to a degree, but it's really you're getting production in the townhomes generally. It's this idea of a plex unit, a duplex, a triplex, a quadplex, a multiplex, as we're calling it. That's where your real opportunity is in terms of really turning up the knob, turning up the opportunity, turning up the ability to deliver more housing that you haven't been delivering in order to meet demand. Right? You can keep building single family homes, you can keep building apartments, you'll keep filling them up. But in order to really meet the demand, we think you need a broader spectrum of housing types. And the thing about this missing middle is it really fits well within your urban services boundary, because it's not a product that needs to be out on the outskirts of town, out on the greenfield site, as we call it. It can be more infill, more strategic, where you can add housing types within the boundary as it is today. So again, I've gotten into this a little bit, but this is just an explanation of what I'm saying here. And then again, I think hopefully you've got some of this in your mind already, that a single family house is, you know, it can be, you know, it could be on a 5-acre lot, but the single family homes typically locally, Lexington, you know, they're usually 2 to 5, not too many are on 5 units per acre, but some. But usually 2 to 4 units per acre, so half-acre lots, quarter-acre lots. You know, these are things that most of us are obviously familiar with in our neighborhoods. But again, you know, we think that this opportunity to really kind of meet demand in a more to meet demand. It's going to take more single family, but it's also going to take a lot of kind of in between. And it doesn't have to all be this high density urban multifamily, as we see down in the bottom right. That there's a spectrum in between. And again, when you get into these plex units, those are the ones that potentially, if you can get them on the ground, they're typically going to be more attainable, right? Where that demand, these can become your sort of first time home buyer products potentially. I mean, they can be rental, but often they're for sale, and they can be more affordable because there's more of them on a single lot, so they can be sold at a lower price typically. So again, as we break that down over time, again, on the left, you see over 20, this is sort of the total numbers over 25 years, and this is kind of broken out on average. And again, you can see this is where we think it's not just taking the household growth numbers and saying, well, this number of households needs this number of homes. But as we look at your demographics, and as we look and we see that, household sizes are shrinking, while certainly single family detached homes are going to be the #1 product type in Lexington that gets built over the next 25 years, we think that if you can broaden the spectrum, there is demand there, and particularly for smaller households that are ascending, right? We see more and more smaller households. We're not necessarily the America of Leave It to Beaver back in the 1960s, when every family was mom, dad, and 2 kids and 2 dogs and a car in the garage. Like, that's still happening. That's still going to happen. It's probably going to be, where the meat of the demand is. But the smaller households are absolutely out there. And if we can sort of unlock some of the land within the urban services boundary, you can really use this missing middle housing, this sometimes we like to call it gentle density, right? Because we're not talking about 50 units the acre. We might be talking about 10 units the acre, 20 units the acre. So it's gentle density, but it allows you to really meet the demand without having to chew up a bunch of more land on the outskirts of town. And so speaking of that total acreage, again, if you look at this and you think about, how much land do we need? And again, you can see we've got your average annual demand, and then we've got your 25-year demand. So if you look in the very bottom right, we're saying that even in the most conservative potential, if you took these housing types and you applied them to the land uses where they're appropriate, you're still talking about over 4,000 acres of demand. And if you were able to really kind of attract as many households that really wanted to be here and meet demand, you could get, you could be talking about over 5,500 acres to satisfy housing demand over time. Now, this is basically, somewhat looking at status quo, if you will. You've gotten some of this Plex product, but this is like, if you let the middle continue to be missing, this is pretty much what it's going to look like. But if you were to really turn up the knobs on this missing middle piece, right? And basically, if you were able to really get as many homes on the ground in this scenario as in this scenario, but you had a more focus on that missing middle, if you were able to get some of that gentle density within the urban services boundary, you can see that you're really keeping your acreage totals down, right? And so that even in the ambitious scenario, you're under 4,000 acres because you're getting a little bit more density with your missing middle housing, as opposed to all of it headed, almost all of it headed out to the single family column, right? You've got, in this ambitious scenario, if you look down at the bottom, ambitious single family, you've got 4,000 single family units and everything else, and you're equating to over 5,000 acres. But if you take some of that demand out of your single family, put it into these missing middle gentle density residential products, you have the same number of homes, but you're chewing up, in this case, 1,500 acres less. And so that allows you to sort of adhere to your urban services boundary. You still get the number of homes demanded, without having to think about expanding the urban services boundary. And again, the point is we're not just shifting numbers around. What we really did was we looked at the demographics and we said, are there the demographics that would allow this to happen? And this is where we landed. Again, in lieu of anything else, a two-person household may end up in a single-family house, but they may decide, that's really not what we need. We're only two people, our kids are gone, or we never had kids, or whatever it is. We don't really need a half-acre lot. We don't really need a 3,000 square foot house. We could be in a duplex and at 2,200 square feet, and it actually fits our lifestyle better. And that's what we're seeing, and that's what a lot of this demand modeling is about, is just thinking about household types, lifestyle choices. And again, this build out scenario where you've got more emphasis on this missing middle product, it allows you to really adhere to your urban services boundary to a much greater extent. So again, I've said a lot of this already, but just to kind of summarize, to put a finer point on these things that I've already said. Again, you're growing. I didn't say this out loud, but your household growth has slowed down a little bit. Your forecast, you haven't really met your forecast, but we don't see it slowing down significantly. You're going to still grow. You're still going to add over 1,000 housing units every year. Again, your pricing has gotten difficult. Part of it is supply, lack of supply. The demand is still there, but you're not building this missing middle, right? And that's what I've been saying. I said previously, and one of the reasons why the missing middle sort of opens up to you also is because we have seen this shift toward renter more, again, nationally and locally. And some of those housing products work better as renters, but they don't have to be. But again, that's just sort of the societal shifts that we're seeing. Have we been shifting a little bit more towards renter? But again, you're still concentrating most of your deliveries in single family and your larger scale multifamily. And so again, number 6 is really the point that I hope you all can take away, is that your future housing products really to be the efficient use of the land to really satisfy your urban services boundary. I think you've got to really find ways to diversify your housing mix, as I was saying. So again, I won't get into all of this, but just know that this is sort of our final recommendations that we handed off to Brittany and team. That we do think that there's really an opportunity to make the most out of your readily developable land, that you don't have to keep expanding. We think there's demand for housing that would fit within the urban services boundary and still be able to sort of adhere to the quality of life that you've come to know and love locally, but that you can do it just a little bit differently and get more out of your land. And again, we think that part of that is really identifying where redevelopment is appropriate. This idea of infill, right? And you can drive around town and you can say, man, where are you going to put this? Well, I would, if you did that, I would say, look closer. Where are there catalytic sites, infill opportunities, sites that you can build on today that can sort of change the nature of an area that you can then continue to grow housing in these infill sites, because they're out there. And it may take some, as it says here on this bullet point, leveraging economic development tools, because this infill development can be harder. Sometimes there's, problems with, whatever land use was there before. You got to clean it up. You got to get the titles right. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be done, but it's worth it in order to really kind of, again, think about how you can sort of do housing differently, but it may take some public-private partnership. And so again, I think this is really where we'll leave it, is that there is this market potential, but the status quo, you're not really hitting you're not hitting on all cylinders right now, because you've really got this, single family and larger multifamily paradigm with not a lot in the middle. And so, there's ways in which you can really unlock more of your already developed land and hit broader segments of the marketplace and have a healthy housing market going into the future. So that's the long and the short of it. There's plenty of nuances that I wasn't able to get into, But that's really kind of the big ideas of what we came up with and looking at housing demand and what it looks like for the next 20, 25 years.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is such an interesting presentation. I've obviously looked over the findings multiple times, and I'm learning new things every time I hear about this information. And I know that it's a lot of information to digest, and we've got some really great questions. And I hope that as you all are thinking about what this means, we really think about, okay, how does this information help all of us make decisions about the policies that we've got to put in place to meet that? I think it raises interesting questions about, what the demand is and what the difference is and what the market can actually deliver. So, why is it so necessary for all of us as community members to get engaged and talk to our local elected officials about what we hope to see and where we hope to see it? So I'm going to jump into some of these questions, Jeff, and we'll go from there. One of the top questions, and I'm curious about your experience, probably not only looking at it here, but maybe across the country, is there's been a lot of conversation about what the impact of real estate investment has been on the price of housing. And so I know that's obviously not something that you looked at specific to this study, but do you have thoughts about what the impact has been of investment groups buying housing and how that might be impacting a market like Lexington's?
Yes, it's definitely something we think about, we talk about a lot. It's, I'm sitting here in Atlanta, and Atlanta's really been ground zero for that kind of activity. I mean, I'll have to say I'm not a sky is falling kind of person on that one particularly. There are major impacts that it can have, and usually what ends up happening is the impacts are the greatest when investment firms will come in and buy up entire streets or entire neighborhoods. They then have enough market power, kind of localized market power, where they can really kind of control the knobs and potentially, push out other buyers, etc. But the fact is that, still nationally, less than 3% of single family homes are owned by large investors. And so, I would say that there is an impact. I would say the impacts are often felt greatest at the micro level when an investor owns multiple properties in one small location. I think when you zoom out to the regional level, I just don't get as worried about that problem as some people do. I mean, we have good conversations about the impacts of this, but frankly, you know, I I think that there needs to be more investment into housing in this country overall. That when we need everybody from mom and pops to big corporations and everybody in between to be investing in housing because we don't have enough of it really nationally. And so I just I recognize that there are impacts, but I don't think it's a leading cause of our affordability crisis, I guess is the bottom line that I would put on that one.
No, I think that that's a helpful perspective, and I think you raised another point, and it's another question, and I know there's been a lot of conversation around it here, and that question is: doesn't this analysis need to take into account supply and demand in neighboring counties as well? And again, this was only looking at Lexington-Fayette County under the premise that we would accommodate every single housing unit that's needed here inside our county lines. And I do think that that raises an interesting question about how we must be thinking about this bigger than just Fayette. We did not do that here, but do you have thoughts on, again, how it's probably unrealistic to think it would all be accommodated here in Fayette County?
Yes. I mean, and again, I'm not unaware of how that dynamic works, particularly, with an urban services boundary. People have cars, people can drive and are willing to drive. And, in today's world where you do have more people working from home and have more flexibility to live further away from where they work, I mean, it's real, it's a thing. But I would say that from I guess really from sort of a priority, kind of a public sector priority conversation that, I would say that you've got the potential to capture back some of the people that are going elsewhere. Now, granted, they're probably, the people who are driving further, are not necessarily going to live on a small lot, right, in a neighboring county. They're probably moving there for a little bit more space, or else they would have bought their home closer, to their work in Lexington. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics there, but at the same time, Lexington specifically as sort of the regional hub, and really the urban center for your region, you've got the ability to put in some interesting housing types that don't really exist or don't exist at scale. Some of these missing middle that I'm talking about. And honestly, you're going to attract people to stay and or move to Lexington that wouldn't have otherwise, and maybe have just chosen to drive a little further to get something a little cheaper. But when they see a house that meets their needs, and it's closer to the action, closer to their work, closer to their shopping, closer to their whatever, some of these housing types, the light bulb will go off, and that you can capture some of that. And by capturing some of that, that's really good for the region. That's good for the city and the region and the county, in that, the closer you can get people to where they work and where they shop, the less traffic there is, the less strain on the infrastructure there is, et cetera, et cetera. So while there is demand that will escape outside the county boundaries, there's no doubt about it. And it does need to be thought about. I think in terms of, you've been able to produce, 11,000 to 1,100 units on average over time. I think it's still a great goal to think about, well, how can we ratchet that up? How can we get to 1,500 units on average over the next 10 years? And again, yes, there will be demand that leaves, but by capturing more of that demand, by having a broader array of housing, that's actually it creates a virtuous cycle. It's good for the economy. There's economic development wins that come along with all of that.
And I think you touched on an important point there, that we broaden the type of housing that we're offering. I think that there's another question, and I think you get to this as well, about the light bulb going off, and that in a lot of ways there needs to be a shift in the way that we think about housing. And what does it mean? The question is, even if there is a high demand for single family homes in our future, the question still remains, can we actually build them at prices that our working families can afford? And I think that is the disconnect between our preference for housing based upon the culture of housing, thinking about, again, this goes back to the kind of the suburb area or suburb growth in the 60s and 70s, about what does it mean, you have a home on a lot and a white picket fence and kind of that idea. And so I think what's interesting about what you're speaking about is that we're seeing difficulty in the market across the nation. In the market can't deliver these single family homes under these certain prices, and that is continuing to grow. And so the question really, I think, is how do we actually meet the demand in that under 300 level? How do we meet a demand for $150,000 starter homes? And it sounds to me, I mean, you answer this, but I think it is that we have to be thinking about the broader diversity of housing types and begin to meet that demand in order to meet the price point that's needed in the community. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, I think that the demographic trends, right, where we've got shrinking households, or at least households that aren't really growing in size anymore. We've got households that are putting off having kids. We've got, all sorts of kind of societal demographic things that are going on, that point us to smaller and or different housing types, just generally, and housing preferences, right? Like, sure, everyone would like to live in a large house out, with lots of land. I mean, theoretically, that ought to work for everybody, but not everyone can afford that. And it's just, again, to your point, Brittany, it's becoming more and more difficult. Just costs to build, land costs, all of that make it exceedingly difficult to hit these kind of first-time home buyer price points. And so, if that's the case, right, like we could go out into suburban lands and try to, I don't know, use our economic development tools to subsidize housing production, out on the outskirts to try to keep prices down. that would be one way to go about it, potentially to subsidize housing production out there so that everybody can have a half-acre lot and a house they can afford. But I don't think that's feasible. And again, I don't think that that's really a good policy tool to really sort of be continuing to subsidize sprawl necessarily because of the infrastructure that it takes to service all that new housing out there. So again, I think that by looking inward, by looking for infill sites, by looking at your current urban services boundary and saying, where can we really maximize the land inside here? I think you can, again, I think there's a lot of virtues to that, but one of those could be that you're able to produce housing that can be more attainable to these first-time home buyers. Again, it's probably going to be a smaller house on a smaller lot. That is true. But if you get it done, it's potentially going to at least create that first rung on the housing ladder, if you will. And I talk about that a lot. How do you create that first rung for people to get their first house so they can then move up? And so again, I mean, even if it's rental housing, right? Like how do you get rental housing that people can afford and again to keep them where you want them. And it's good for sort of your societal benefits, but it's also good for your economy, right? And to keep your essential workers near their jobs. How do we provide rungs on the housing ladder at the lower levels so that when they move up, they're here and they, at some point they may move out and buy that bigger house. But like we've got the potential because we've got the land and we've got the economic development tools to get some housing in town to create those first rungs of the housing ladder.
Gosh, we've got lots of great questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. One question about the rental market: is a 3-to-1 ratio of new rental housing to new homeowner housing typical of similar size and similar demographic cities? And should we, are there policies that you've seen in maybe other communities that you've looked at to amend that ratio or impact that ratio?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to really say there's one size fits all on that, particularly in a college town. And again, I mean that there's college town housing dynamics. I mean, I don't have to tell you all. they're different, and we know that when we do these types of things. And so I think that your ratio is probably about where if we just look at across the board other similar, as you said, similar size types of towns. I would say it's not so dissimilar, but again, I mean, every city is certainly different. But I also think that again, like, most, if you took a room full of people, you're just us average Joes, and we said, let's build some housing. Should it be rental or should it be for sale? I mean, I think most of us would say, yeah, well, if we can, let's make it for sale. That's good. There's lots of reasons why we would want to make it for sale. Sure. But again, that idea of this rungs on the ladder, this idea of opportunity, housing choice. I mean, everything in today's world is sort of pointing us to this continuation of renters, in the marketplace. And so, I don't find that rental housing is a bad word. I'm a proponent of all types of housing to meet the demand that is out there. And there certainly is demand for rental housing along with for sale housing. And so again, I think, I don't think you're far off from other similar sized college towns, but I also think that, there's opportunities across the board. And again, I think that, if it becomes a priority for the city, for the government, for the local government to, to really kind of prioritize for sale housing inside the urban services boundary, that's fine. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a different sort of tool set, right? You gotta have a tool set to go attack that. And that tool set may be different than the rental side of things. So, it's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah, no, and I think, as we see that continue to be a priority, again, I think it just reinforces the idea of having that broad spectrum of types of housing that are so essential to fill the home ownership void that we're seeing that goes a lot to rentals. One of the popular questions here is the lack of supply for condos due to lack of demand, or are condos a potential path to increasing ownership percentages medium to long term?
I would say the answer to the first question is a lack of demand. I would say generally no. I would say is it a potential to be one of those first rungs on the ladder? I would say yes. But I think there's an issue in between, and a lot of it goes, there's a few issues, but basically the market is having a hard time delivering condos. For one thing, the post Great Recession, we're still dealing with the long tail of the Great Recession, in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. As lending standards got tightened down, and in some cases very tight, it sort of wiped out a lot of those mortgages that had been going to buy condos back in those days. The way they tightened down the mortgage restrictions have really put a crimp on the condo market and on the buy side. It's the opportunities to get a mortgage to buy a condo are just not there the way they used to be. There's also problems with insurance. I mean, you see now there's problems with insurance across the board. But when it comes specifically to this, a lot of those condos that were built in, call it 2004, 5, 6, almost all of them have run into it. I mean, I hate to say almost all of them, but a good number of them have run into issues of, their HOAs are suing the builders. There's just sort of this kind of going back and forth, where newer condo buildings built in the pre-recession days have turned into sort of headaches for their owners, for their HOAs, for their builders. And so again, you're seeing, banks are not as willing to not just give the mortgages to the buyers, but are having a hard time with the development loans. They just really don't want to get involved in condo development. And so I'm oversimplifying both of those things, but they're both true. And there's other issues in between that just say that the market is having a hard time delivering condos. But if the market could deliver condos at a higher level, I'm certainly, and hit those price points below 300, I think there would be buyers for them if they could get a loan.
No, I think that raises a lot of points about how complex these conversations are about housing and all of the different factors that go into the cost of housing, the supply and demand of housing, and pulling in that financing piece being a huge aspect of it that I think we don't talk about quite as often, about how can we increase the types of homes that are financeable from a development perspective, because that has to change as well. But it's also critical that it does change. So all of these different things play a huge role in this, and there were so many great questions. We are going to go to our next presentation, but thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate all your work and being here with us tonight. So thank you again for the presentation, and we appreciate you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.